Moed Katan Daf Gimel is the last daf in the second parak of the Masechta. Contains 3 mishnayos, and it goes through a number of topics regarding types of work, types of malacha that would be permitted or forbidden on Chol HaMoed. It also talks about Erev Pesach and compares Erev Pesach to Chol HaMoed. Amongst the malachas will be discussed will be buying and selling things which require the writing of a contract. The Gemara will discuss, are you allowed to do that in order to give a person work because he needs to have money in order to buy food for Yom Tov? Is that a significant reason to allow it? We'll also talk about covering things which will be lost and what type of covering you're allowed to do, and the Gemara will describe some terms and what they mean. Now the first topic, which we'll begin with, is that we've seen previously that you're not allowed to schedule work to be done on Yom Tov, on Chol HaMoed, and then you'll say, oh, well, I have to do it now because it's going to be destroyed. So if you have something that needs to be done, don't schedule it to be done on Chol HaMoed, because that will not be an excuse. If you scheduled it for Chol HaMoed, Chazal made a knas. They said you're not allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed, and if you do, we will take your profit away from you, because you cannot go and schedule activities and then claim that you have to do it. So everyone wants to know, what if somebody scheduled work to be done on Chol HaMoed, and they're we're going to knas him, but then he died, and now his son inherits the estate. Does the knas apply to the son? Is it a knas only on the person, only on the one who scheduled it, or is it on the property? The property which was scheduled to be improved on Chol HaMoed cannot be, and therefore that would go over to the son, and he would also have the same restriction. Now the Gemara notes, the same question can be asked in 2 other circumstances. There we know the answer, and here we would not know the answer. So first of all, the halacha is you're not allowed to make yimum on a bachar. Every person as a firstborn kosher animal has to give it to the kohen to bring as a carbon. If it gets a mum, then he gets to use it himself, the kohen, that is. He's allowed to use it himself, doesn't have to bring it as a carbon. So one who nicks the ear, makes a little mum on this bachar, would then be able to say, oh, I have a mum. There's a mum on the animal, I get to keep it myself. So Gemara says that there's a knas on him, and we say that he's not allowed to do that. And he would not be able to use it. He would not be able to sell it and use it, and not be able to use the funds, and not be able to use the bachar himself. He could ask the same thing, if he makes that mum and then he dies, can his son use it? And over there the answer is no. That knas goes over to the son as well. But that could be because over there he violated an issue deraisa. He made a mum and a carbon, and not allowed to do that. So maybe that's why the knas goes over to the son, but in this case it wouldn't. Another case is if somebody who sells his eved, Eved Kanani, which is chayiv in mitzvahs to some extent, he sells him to a guy. And now he's in a situation where he can't do mitzvahs. So he's not allowed to do that. And if he does, there's a knas, and he's never allowed to get the Eved back. Even if he escapes, he cannot, if he escapes his new owner, he cannot take possession of him and have him work for him in any way. And that's again because he's violating the situation. He's putting the Eved in a environment where he won't be able to keep the mitzvahs that is chayiv. But that might be different because over there he's really causing him a major issue. There's an ongoing situation in which he can't do mitzvahs. Maybe that's why we knast him. That situation continues even after the original owner had died. Now, the question here though is, what about this? Is the knas, is the fine on the money or is the fine on the person, and does it go over to the son or not? So the Gemara presents a proof. So Gemara says that we seemingly learned this in the Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about Shemitah. And it says as follows. It says that if you clear thorns out of a field during Shemitah, then you're allowed to plow it after Shemitah. That's fine. It's not a problem. If, however, you fertilize it during Shemitah and you want to plant it after Shemitah, then it depends what kind of fertilization you did. If you actually scattered fertilizer, which is a big, thick, heavy layer, then you're not allowed to. Plant it the year after. If you had animals locked up in there, then you fertilize it with the fact that they were there, and therefore they dropped waste material on it, which is fertilizer, you're also not allowed to plant it into Shemitah year. Now, the Gemara there says that Rav Yossi Bar Chanina says that if a person fertilized the field in one of these 2 ways and then he died, his son is allowed to plant that field after the Shemitah year. We don't say that the knas applies to him. So you see that this should be the same thing on Chol HaMoed. The knas applies to the original person who did it. It does not apply to the son. It doesn't stay afterwards. And where's the second proof? And that's concerning somebody who is metame tahar food. Now, if you are matame somebody else's food, you didn't actually destroy the food. The food looks just the same as it did before. So it's not technically a case of causing damage to another. It is, however, causing him a loss, because now he can't use it. It's tameh, and he's not able to eat it if he's a person that has to eat b'tahara. So therefore, the Chazal made a knas on you have to pay him for the food. Now, what if the person who is metameh, he dies? Does the son have to pay it? And there again, the rule is that he does not have to pay, because the knas is only on the father and not on the son. So therefore, you see that these knasos don't go over to the son. Okay, now we got to our next Mishnah. Mishnah discusses writing up contracts. So it says if you're going to buy something which requires a contract, like the purchase of a home or an eved or animals, you're not allowed to buy those things at all on Yom Tov unless you need them for Yom Tov. Unless there is a Yom Tov need, it says. Now, also, you could buy them if you have to provide something for the seller. The seller needs income. He doesn't have money to buy food, so you want to buy it from him so that he can have income. And the Mishnah adds what appears to be an extra line, and it says because he doesn't have anything to eat. Now that would seem to be an extra line. You just say that he needs the income, that's enough. Why do you have to say he doesn't have anything to eat? So it says maybe that can help us solve a question which we've been wondering, and that is, if somebody needs income, are you allowed to hire him as a worker? We said here that you're allowed to buy something from him, which you ordinarily would not be allowed to buy from him on Chol HaMoed. Question is, can you hire him? Normally you can't hire a worker on Chol HaMoed. This guy needs income, are you allowed to? So the Gemara wants to say maybe the extra phrase in our Mishnah, because he doesn't have anything to eat, is coming to talk about that case. Not just the person who's going to sell you something on Chol HaMoed, but even somebody who just wants to work for you on Chol HaMoed, so his income, you're allowed to hire him. That's what the extra phrase doesn't have what to eat means. So Gemara says not necessarily. It could just mean that the Mishnah is explaining itself. The Mishnah said that if somebody is allowed to sell you animals if he needs you, if he has a need to sell because he doesn't have anything to eat. That can be explained. The Gemara says, okay, I'll show you another very similar Mishnah where again you have a very similar phrase, and here you won't be able to use that answer. That's that it says you're not allowed to lend money in Chol HaMoed and write up a loan. Now you can lend money without a loan if you would like to, and if you don't trust the guy, meaning if you want to lend money to somebody, don't trust that he's going to pay you back, so then you're allowed to even write up the loan. Now, if he doesn't have anything to eat, you're also allowed to write up the loan. So the Gemara says here, the extra phrase, the phrase is for sure extra. You're not explaining anything. You already said that if he doesn't trust him, then he is allowed to write up the loan document. So what are you adding because he doesn't have anything to eat? You already said it's permitted even if he has what to eat. They can't be explaining because it's not true. If you just want to lend money to the guy and you want to write up a loan document and you don't trust he's going to pay you back without it, you're allowed to. So it can't be explaining. So the extra phrase doesn't have what to eat must be referring to a different case, and it must be referring to where you just want to hire somebody so that he can make some money. So he can have what to eat. So the Gemara accepts that. It's a valid proof. But now the Gemara has some kashas. So the Gemara first says, is a Mishnah discussing working on Erev Pesach. The halacha is you're not allowed to do malacha on Erev Pesach unless it's l'tzarech Yom Tov, unless it's needed for the Yom Tov itself. So the Gemara says that would seem to be a very similar halacha to the halacha that you're not allowed to do work on Chol HaMoed unless it's needed for Yom Tov. Now, so we have a Mishnah that says that there's three types of work you're allowed to do on Erev Pesach. Tailors are allowed to sew, haircutters are allowed to give haircuts, and launderers are allowed to wash clothing. The reason they're allowed to do that is because there's a permitted version of that even on Chol HaMoed itself. You're allowed to sew for somebody in an unskilled way on Chol HaMoed. We said you're allowed to do unprofessional stitches. And laundry and haircut you're allowed to do for somebody who just came home from overseas or somebody who just came out of jail. You're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. Therefore it's permitted. So the Gemara is learning the halachos of work on Erev Pesach from the halachos of Chol HaMoed. And just like that's permitted when it's not l'tzarech Yom Tov, this is permitted even when it's not l'tzarech Yom Tov for these three things. So now the Gemara says, this is clearly in the case that there's nothing else that's permitted in Chol HaMoed. Otherwise, you would be allowed to do those things in Erev Pesach too. Now, according to what you're claiming here, you're allowed to do anything. You're allowed to hire somebody as long as the guy needs parnasa. So then any activity should be permitted on Erev Pesach, because any activity is permitted on Chol HaMoed in order to give income to the guy. So Gemara says, obviously, this question's wrong. Obviously, this is a wrong assumption over here. The Gemara says it's not true. You can't just learn any activity that's mutter in some circumstance on Chol HaMoed automatically means that it should be permitted on Erev Pesach. That's not true. The Gemara says, I'll show you another example of that. you're allowed to knock down a wall on Chol Hamoed if it's leaning over the public street and it can fall on somebody. Does that mean you're allowed to build and destroy walls, whatever you want on Erev Pesach? This is a permitted way you're allowed to do it on Chol Hamoed? Obviously not. So it works as follows. The reason that Erev Pesach you're not allowed to do work is because you're only allowed to do things that Tzarech Yom Tov. It has to be, we restricted your activities, then L'Kavod Yom Tov. On Chol Hamoed, that's one of the reasons you're not allowed to do work, and therefore we, in any situation where we took that Isser off, then you can learn from that to Erev Pesach. Here, there's a different problem. Chol Hamoed has a problem of tircha. It has a problem of too much work, too much exertion. That's not solved. That is solved if somebody's going to cause a loss. So if you want to take care of a loss, like somebody doesn't have what to eat, or somebody who has a wall that could fall on him, that's taken away if because there's a loss. So the problem of tircha is removed. That means that on Chol Hamoed, if that was your only problem, these activities are permitted. That doesn't have anything to do with Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach, there's no Isser of tircha. You're allowed to exert yourself as much as you want on Erev Pesach, and therefore these things won't be permitted. They'll only be permitted if they're Tzarech Yom Tov, like we said before. Now, another example of this the Gemara brings is a scribe is allowed to write a ksuba or a get or receipts. These are all things that you're allowed to do on Chol Hamoed, and you're not allowed to do on Erev Pesach. Therefore, it's another example. All right. Now we get to our next Mishnah. Next Mishnah discusses moving items from one house to another house. And over here, we don't want you to move things. There's two problems involved. First of all, it's a tircha. It's a shlep to move things from one house to another. And second of all, it's a public event. People are going to see you dragging things, and they're going to think that you did a sale or work or whatever else they may think has been happening over here. It's a weekday activity for sure. So Gemara says, the Mishnah says that it depends how far you're moving it, and the Gemara explains it. So the first phrase in the Mishnah is you're not allowed to clear items out of one house into another house. Then it says you are allowed to clear it out into a chutzner. So Gemara explains what this means is you're allowed to go to a nearby house and not to a faraway house. So if you have a house in the same chutzner you want to clear it to, you're allowed to. If you have a house in a different chutzner you want to clear it to, that you're not allowed to do. Now, what about a situation where you're afraid of loss? So that's where you gave items to a repairman to fix, and now you want to pick them up from him. So you're not allowed to take things from his house to your house. That's the same Isser. However, if you're afraid they're going to be lost, destroyed, damaged, stolen, either by him or by somebody else, then you're allowed to move them. But you're not allowed to necessarily bring them home. You can move them, it says, to a different house. That implies you can take it from the fixer, from the worker's house, the craftsman's house, to a nearby house. But you cannot move it all the way back to your own house. Okay, the Gemara explains, like we said, the difference between the first case and the second case. Now the Gemara says that Rava he tested Rav Papa and his Chaverim by asking him a contradiction between two Mishnayos. One says you're allowed to bring things from the craftsman's house, and one says you're not allowed to bring things from the craftsman's house. Contradiction. So Gemara says we gave him a few answers. He said, first of all, one's talking about Chol Hamoed, one's talking about Erev Pesach. The Isser is tircha, Chol Hamoed tircha zasa, Erev Pesach tircha is mutter. Another answer we said is that one is talking about where you trust the guy, and one is talking about where you don't trust the guy. Like we said in the Mishnah here, only if you don't trust him, you're allowed to move it. If you trust him, you're not allowed to move it. So the Mishnah that says you're allowed to move it is talking about where you don't trust him. You're afraid it's going to be destroyed. The Mishnah says you're not allowed to move it is where you do trust him. You're not allowed to move it for any reason. Now the Gemara says, I bring you a brisa that shows that this is the case. Brisa says you're allowed to bring a kalim from the house of a uman, from the house of a worker on Chol Hamoed. For example, if you have a glass pitcher in the or a clay pitcher in the house of the clay maker or the glass maker, so you are allowed to bring those to your house. And that's because they're needed for Yom Tov. You're not allowed to bring wool from the house of the worker who colors it, because you're not going to need that for Yom Tov. You can't do anything with raw wool on Yom Tov. You can't bring kalim from the Uman's house or anything else which is not used on Yontif. Now, if the worker doesn't have what to eat, and you want to give him some income, so you're allowed to pay him, but you have to leave the thing near him. You cannot bring it home. If you don't trust him, then you're allowed to move it to someone else's house nearby. If you don't have anybody nearby that you trust, you can move it to a person in another courtyard. If you don't have anyone even in another courtyard, you're even allowed to bring it home, but you have to do it quietly and privately at night. So here you see again that if you trust, you're allowed to bring it. If you don't trust, you're not allowed to bring it. Now, Rava said this is not a good answer, because this answer only helps for taking a kli from the worker's house to your house. However, that Mishnah has an addendum there that says that anything you're allowed to bring from the worker's house, you're also allowed to bring from your house to his house. So according to your answer, there should be no reason you're allowed to bring it from your house to his house. There's no trust issues if it's in your own house. So therefore, you haven't solved the problem, really. The contradiction still stands as far as the case of bringing something from your house to the worker's house. So Rav Papa says, okay, we'll have to go with our first answer. One is talking about Erev Pesach, and one is talking about Chol Moed. All right, now we get to the last Mishnah in the Perek. So this Mishnah says that you have figs that are drying. If it rains on them, it'll get ruined. You're allowed to cover them. So we have two terms for covering. One is mechapin and one is me'avin. So Gemara will explain what the difference between the two is. Tanakama says you can do mechapin. Rav Yehuda says you can even do me'avin. Now, people who sell fruit, clothing, kalim, so they're allowed to sell it for the needs of Yom Tov, Tzarech Yom Tov, but only privately, only quietly. You cannot make a scene out of it. It can't be a public event. Now, hunters and people who grind up grain and grind up beans, they're allowed to work with Tzarech Yom Tov only. Rav Yaisi says they were machmer upon themselves. They took a stringency upon themselves. And the Gemara is going to explain what that stringency is. What does he mean? So first of all, what is mechapin and what is me'avin? So Gemara has a machlokas. First opinion, machlokas Chi bar Abba and Rav Asi as to what Chizkiah and Rav Yochanan said. The first opinion is that mechapin means that you cover it sparsely, loosely, with not a very thick cover. Ma'avin is that you cover it thickly with a nice, thick, dense layer. Second opinion is that both of those are called mechapin, both of those are called covering. Ma'avin means you pile it up in a heap so that it's easier to cover. Now that's supported by a brisa that says that ma'avin, like a kri. You're allowed to make it ma'avin like a kri. Kri is a mound, a pile of grain, and this is Rav Yehuda speaking here in the brisa. Rav Yehuda is the one who says you're allowed to do it in our Mishnah. Okay. Now the Gemara refers to the fact that Rav Yaisi says that the people who sell fruit, clothing, and kalim, and the trappers, the grain grinders and the bean grinders, they're allowed to do their work quietly in private. And Rav Yaisi says that they took a chumrah. So Gemara says, what was the chumrah? The chumrah was that they're going to do it privately, and he's agreeing with the Tanakama, or the chumrah was that they're not even going to do it privately, they're not going to do it at all. Which one is it? So Gemara brings a Mishnah that clearly shows that they're not going to do it at all. The Mishnah says people who sell fruit, clothing, and the kalim, you're allowed to sell privately. Rav Yosi says that the merchants of Tveria took a chumrah on themselves not to sell anything at all. Hunters of animals, birds, and fish are allowed to hunt them for L'tzarech Yom Tov. And Rav Yosi says that the hunters of Akko took a stringency upon themselves that they're not going to trap it at all on Chol Moed. Okay. Next, our third is that people who grind up chilka, targis, and tisane, and we're going to explain what those are, they're allowed to do it privately and L'tzarech Yom Tov. And again, Rav Yosi says the ones in Sipari took a chumrah themselves, they're not going to do it on Chol Moed. Now, therefore, you see that the chumrah is that they're not going to do these things on Chol Moed at all. Now, the Gemara wants to know what are these three things. What is chilka, what is targis, and what is tisane? So, we have a machlokes about chilka. Abaye says as follows. Abaye says chilka is where you took wheat kernels and divided them in half, from the word chalak, from the word chelek, to split in half. Chad, targis is where you divide it into three. And the tisane is divided into four. But otherwise, they're all really cut wheat, and it's used as grits. You boil it up, and it becomes like oatmeal. Next, the Gemara says, Rav Dimi has a different opinion. He says, no, chilka is not wheat. Chilka is spelt, and it's whole. The shell is removed, but it's whole. Gemara has some kashas on Rav Dimi. First kasha is a brisa which discusses the halachos of hechsher tumah. The halacha is that something which grows from the ground only becomes tamei if it was first cut from the ground and became wet. And whether or not grain is assumed to have become wet and flour, and therefore is ready to become tamei, depends on where it's from. In the villages, they don't wash their grain, and therefore it's not necessarily assumed to be hechsher tamei. It cannot become tamei until it becomes wet. And in the big cities, they do wash the grain, and therefore you have to assume that it's washed, and therefore it does become wet. The brisa says, however, chilka is different. Chilka, even if it comes from the villages, you have to assume became wet. In order to make chilka, becomes wet. And now I understand Abaye, it had to become wet in order to be able to cut it in half. According to Rav Dimi, that is just spelt, why should it have to be wet? The Gemara says it has to be made wet in order to get the peels off. Chilka is peeled, spelt, and you got to get the peels off, and therefore it has to become wet as well. Now, the next kasha is from somebody who makes a neder, makes a promise that he's not going to eat grain. So we have a brisa. So he's not going to eat grain. He's not allowed to eat dried Egyptian beans. That counts as grain. He is allowed to eat fresh Egyptian beans because that doesn't count as grain. How do you define grain? Grain is anything which is harvested and stored in piles like huge mountains of grain, a kree of grain. So dried Egyptian beans is grain. It's stored that way, and fresh is not stored that way. Now, the brisa continues and says he's also allowed to eat rice, chilka, targis, and tesane. These things don't count as grain. So the Gemara says, according to Abaye, that's very good, because these are all things that are cut into pieces. Once it's cut into pieces, it's not stored as grain anymore, so the term grain no longer applies to it. According to Rav Dimi, that it's just spelt, peeled spelt, it's still stored in piles, and it should still have the halacha that it counts as grain, and this person is not allowed to eat it. So Gemara accepts that, and Gemara says it's a valid kasha. Now the Gemara goes on to a different subject just before the end of the parak, which is, are you allowed to sell things on Chol Moed? So Rav Huna allowed people to sell spices on Chol Moed. Gemara has a kasha on that. Why are you allowed to sell spices on a Chol Moed? We have a brisa that says that if you have a store, you want to keep it open on Chol Moed so people could buy things for Yontif, it has to be done quietly, and it depends where your store is located. If it opens up into a private seating area in the market, like a side area, so then it's not considered to be too much too much in the public eye, and you can keep the doors open. But if it opens onto the main street, you can only keep one door open to show some measure of privacy. But on Hoshana Rabbah, you're allowed to open up wide, and everybody could buy fruit in honor of the great day of Hoshana Rabbah and Shemini Atzeres, which is a different yontif. We want people to have a big suda. Remember, says it's clear here that besides for that, you're not allowed to sell. It's only to sell the covered yontif that you're allowed to sell all these things in the street. So why does Rav Huna say that they're allowed to sell spices? Someone says it's not a kasha. Spices and fruit are different. Fruit you buy a lot at a time, and they'll therefore appear that you're buying it for after yontif. Therefore, we say you have to sell it privately so that people shouldn't see and get that assumption. Spices, you sell a little at a time, and it's not going to look like you're buying it for after Yontif. Therefore, Rav Huna allowed the spice merchants to sell it even in the street, in public, without any privacy, without any concern for that.